Last spring, Susan opened her grandmother's forgotten recipe box and discovered something far more valuable than old family recipes. Hidden behind faded index cards was a small 1961 ledger filled with strange numbers, symbols, and rules that looked almost like a secret code. What she uncovered was a powerful money system that helped ordinary housewives survive rising prices, avoid financial stress, and quietly build security without banks, credit cards, or financial experts. In this video, you'll discover 15 forgotten rules that still work today. Which rule shocked you most? Comment below. And stay until the end. The final secret may completely change how you manage money. Picture a quiet street in a small American town. Early morning, dew still on the grass. A woman named Patricia steps onto her porch in her housecoat, glass bottles clinking as she sets out the empty ones from yesterday. This was routine. Every neighborhood had it. The milkman, the iceman, sometimes the knife sharpener rolling his cart down the block. These were small, recurring services, paid for in coins, usually left in a little tin box by the door. What most families didn't realize was that Patricia, like many housewives of her time, had quietly turned this coin routine into something bigger. Every week, she would round up. If the milk cost 32 cents, she'd leave 35. If the bread man came by for 40 cents, she'd leave 45. The extra coins didn't go back into her purse. They went into a second tin, hidden behind the flour canister, one that no one else in the house knew about. Over a month, those nickels and dimes added up to something real. Over a year, it became a private reserve, money set aside specifically for the unexpected. A broken shoe, a doctor's visit, a bad week at the factory where her husband worked. This wasn't a bank account. It couldn't be seen on any statement. It was invisible, personal, and entirely her own decision. Here's the modern comparison. Today, in 2026, American women are told to build an emergency fund through automatic transfers, apps, and complicated budgeting software. But Patricia's method proves something simpler, that consistency in small, almost invisible amounts can create real breathing room without needing a single spreadsheet. Linda, a mother of 3 in Ohio, tried a version of this last year with her coffee spending and was stunned by what she found sitting untouched after 90 days. But the milkman reserve was only the beginning, because what Patricia did with her grocery bag every single week was even more unusual and far more controversial among her neighbors. Grocery shopping in 1961 looked nothing like it does now. No loyalty apps, no cash back offers, just cash, a list, and a strict sense of discipline that most families don't practice today. Deborah, a housewife from a small Midwestern town, followed a rule that seemed almost strange to her neighbors at the time. Whenever she went to the store, she never spent everything she budgeted for that week. Instead, she followed what her own mother had taught her, a 60-40 split. 60% of her grocery money went toward what the family needed for the week ahead, but 40% quietly, consistently went toward what she called the extra bag. This wasn't hoarding, it wasn't panic buying, it was patient, deliberate preparation for prices that everyone somehow sensed were only going to climb. The extra bag wasn't extravagant, a few cans of vegetables, a little more flour than needed, a small amount of coffee, sugar, or oil, items that didn't spoil quickly and were always going to be used eventually. Over weeks, this extra bag became a second pantry, untouched until prices rose or money got tight, and when it did happen, Deborah's family barely noticed the difference because she had already paid yesterday's prices for tomorrow's needs. This is strikingly different from today's stockpile culture, which often means buying in bulk out of fear or convenience, sometimes with items families don't even use. Deborah's method was intentional and small-scale, guided by real need, not panic. It required patience, not impulse. Jennifer, a viewer of channels like this one, once mentioned trying something similar during a particularly expensive winter, setting aside just a small percentage of her grocery budget each week for staples. She said it didn't feel like sacrifice, it felt like control. But controlling groceries was only one part of Deborah's system, because inside her home, hidden in a cabinet by the back door, was something even more surprising, a physical device that quietly kept her entire family from overspending on electricity and water. Barbara lived in a modest two-bedroom home with her husband and two children. Bills in 1961 were simple compared to today, but they mattered just as much, especially on a single income. What made Barbara different from her neighbors wasn't a special appliance or a secret discount. It was a habit rooted entirely in physical awareness, something she called her utility lock. Every month, Barbara calculated exactly how much electricity and water her family could use without straining the budget. Then, instead of hoping everyone would remember to be careful, she made it physically difficult to overuse. She placed a small wooden marker on the light switch panel, a visual reminder each time someone reached for it. She set specific bath times for the children, using a simple kitchen timer to keep water use consistent. Certain lamps were unplugged entirely during the day, not because they were unsafe, but because unused light was, in her words, wasted money burning quietly. This wasn't extreme, it was structured. Barbara wasn't trying to live without comfort, she was trying to prevent invisible waste, the kind that slowly drains a budget without anyone noticing until the bill arrives. And it worked. Her utility costs stayed remarkably stable year after year, even as prices around her crept upward. Compare that to now. In 2026, families rely on smart thermostats, apps, and automated systems to track energy use. These tools are helpful, but they often require monthly subscriptions or expensive equipment. Barbara's version required nothing but attention and a shared family agreement. Mary, a retired teacher from Pennsylvania, once said her own mother used a nearly identical system, and to this day, Mary still turns off lamps out of habit decades later. The lesson here isn't about deprivation, it's about awareness, physically building a routine your family can feel, not just read about on a screen. But Barbara's discipline wasn't limited to bills. It extended all the way to her kitchen table, where a single Sunday meal was quietly transformed into an entire week's worth of food. Sunday, in most 1961 households, meant one thing: a roast. Chicken, beef, sometimes a modest cut of pork, depending on what the family could afford that week. For Karen, a mother raising 4 children on her husband's factory wages, Sunday dinner wasn't just a meal, it was the foundation of the entire week's food plan. The roast itself was served fresh on Sunday, the centerpiece of a full family dinner, but nothing about it ended there. On Monday, the leftover meat was sliced thin and turned into sandwiches for lunch. By Tuesday, the remaining pieces were shredded into a simple stew, stretched further with potatoes, carrots, and whatever vegetables were in season. Wednesday often brought a pot pie, using the last bits of meat combined with a homemade crust. And by the end of the week, even the bones weren't wasted. They became the base for a rich broth used in soups that carried the family through to the next Sunday. This wasn't seen as clever at the time, it was simply expected. Every housewife knew how to stretch a single roast across 4 completely different meals, minimizing waste almost entirely. Nothing sat forgotten in the icebox, nothing spoiled before it could be used. Compare that to today's kitchens, where food waste has become a quiet, expensive epidemic. Nancy, a grandmother in Texas, recently mentioned that reviving this exact rotation, 1 roast, 4 transformations, cut her weekly grocery bill noticeably within the first month. Karen's system wasn't about being frugal for its own sake. It was about respect. Respect for the money her husband earned and the effort it took to bring that roast home in the first place. But food wasn't the only thing being stretched in Karen's neighborhood, because just down the street, an entirely different kind of economy was quietly operating, one that didn't use cash at all. Every Thursday afternoon, a small group of women gathered on Margaret's porch. On the surface, it looked like nothing more than friendly conversation over coffee. But underneath that casual gathering was a system that quietly kept dozens of families from spending money they didn't have. Margaret called it the swap circle, though no one gave it a formal name at the time. Sarah brought out outgrown children's clothes. Michelle brought canning jars she no longer needed. Someone else brought garden vegetables that had grown in excess. Nothing was sold. Nothing involved cash changing hands. Instead, families simply traded what they had for what they needed, based on trust built over years of neighborhood relationships. A coat too small for one child became perfect for another. A spare set of curtains found a new home. Even tools were passed between husbands, borrowed for a weekend project and returned without a second thought. This wasn't charity, it was community economics, built entirely on reciprocity and quiet generosity. What made this system so effective was its consistency. It happened regularly, not just during hard times. Because it was built into weekly life, no one felt embarrassed asking for what they needed or offering what they no longer used. It removed the shame that often surrounds financial struggle. Today, similar ideas exist in the form of online buy-nothing groups, which have grown popular across the country. But something is often missing in the digital version: the face-to-face trust, the immediate relationship, the sense of being genuinely known by your neighbors. Lisa, a mother from Georgia, said she joined an online swap group last year but found it far less consistent than the small in-person circle her own grandmother described decades earlier. Margaret's porch wasn't just a meeting place, it was an economy built on relationships instead of receipts. But even with swapping, some items simply couldn't be replaced easily. And when something broke, 1961 housewives had one more trick, one that modern families have almost entirely forgotten how to do. In Emily's sewing basket sat a small wooden box, worn smooth at the edges from years of use. Inside were needles of every size, thread in dozens of colors, and small scraps of fabric saved specifically for one purpose: invisible mending. When her husband's work trousers tore at the knee, Emily didn't consider replacing them. She sat by the window in the evening light and carefully rewove the fabric, thread by thread, matching the pattern so closely that the tear became nearly impossible to see. When a favorite wool sweater developed a small hole, she didn't discard it. She patched it from the inside, using a technique passed down from her own mother, blending old fabric with new so seamlessly that the sweater looked untouched. This wasn't just about saving money, though it certainly did that. It was a mindset, the belief that most things could be restored rather than replaced. Shoes were resoled instead of thrown away. Umbrellas were recovered rather than tossed at the first broken rib. Even socks were darned using a wooden mushroom-shaped tool, a small object many young women today have never even seen. Compare this to now, where a small tear often means an item goes straight into the trash, replaced within days through a quick online order. The convenience is undeniable, but the cost adds up quickly, and very few people today know how to extend the life of what they already own. Jessica, a young mother who recently began learning basic sewing repair, said she was shocked by how much money she saved in just a few months simply by fixing small tears instead of replacing clothing altogether. It wasn't about becoming an expert seamstress, it was about slowing down enough to try. Emily's invisible mending kept her family's wardrobe intact for years. But her frugality didn't stop at fabric. It extended even to how far her family was allowed to travel each week. Gasoline in 1961 wasn't as expensive as it is today, but for many working-class families, every trip still cost something that mattered. Nancy's family lived by an unspoken rule her husband had set early in their marriage. Nearly everything they needed had to exist within a 5-mile radius of their home. Grocery shopping happened at the closest store, even if a slightly cheaper option existed farther away. Church, school, the doctor, even most of their friendships existed within that same small circle. This wasn't about limitation for its own sake. It was about eliminating unnecessary fuel costs, unnecessary time, and unnecessary temptation to spend money along the way. Because Nancy's family rarely drove far, they rarely encountered the impulse purchases that come with long trips, a stop at an unfamiliar store, a treat bought simply because they were already out and about. Their entire financial life became simpler simply by staying close to home. This idea feels almost foreign today, in a culture built around convenience, delivery, and long commutes. Many American families now drive significant distances weekly, often without realizing how much that adds up in fuel, wear on the vehicle, and impulsive stops along the way. Susan, a viewer from Michigan, mentioned trying a modified version of this rule last year, intentionally limiting errands to a smaller radius around her home. She said the change wasn't dramatic, but the savings on gas alone were noticeable within a single month. Nancy's radius wasn't a form of isolation, it was intentional simplicity, designed to protect both time and money in a world with far fewer resources than we have today. But keeping the family close to home meant something else, too. It meant finding cheaper ways to stay informed and entertained, which brings us to one of the most surprising habits of them all. Before streaming subscriptions and endless notifications, families like Deborah's relied on something far simpler for information and entertainment: the penny post and the local newspaper. For just a few cents, families could send letters to relatives, stay connected across long distances, and receive news through shared community newspapers, often passed between 2 or 3 households to save money. Entertainment wasn't a monthly bill. It was the radio, shared as a family in the evening, or borrowed books from the local library, returned and exchanged regularly. There was no autoplay, no endless scrolling, no forgotten subscriptions quietly draining a bank account each month. Compare that to now, where the average American household spends a significant amount each month on overlapping digital subscriptions, many of which go unused entirely. Alongside this frugal approach to entertainment, women in 1961 also relied on something called the home medicine cabinet, not filled with expensive prescriptions, but with practical kitchen-based remedies for minor everyday discomforts. Barbara kept ginger for upset stomachs, honey and warm water for sore throats, and simple saltwater rinses passed down through generations. This wasn't about replacing real medical care. It was about preventative, everyday wellness that didn't require a trip to the pharmacy for every small issue. Michelle, a mother in North Carolina, said learning some of these simple, traditional remedies from her own grandmother helped her family avoid unnecessary pharmacy trips for minor colds and stomach aches, saving both time and money throughout the year. Together, these two habits reveal something important. Housewives in 1961 weren't just managing money, they were managing attention, health, and family well-being, with the same quiet discipline they applied to every dollar. But there was one final habit, quieter than all the others, that tied every single lesson together, something hidden inside the linen closet. At the very back of Margaret's linen closet sat a small stack of sheets, towels, and tablecloths, carefully folded, untouched for years. These weren't forgotten. they were an investment. In 1961, quality linens, blankets, and household textiles were purchased with intention, chosen for durability rather than style trends. Families bought fewer items, but items built to last 10, sometimes 15 years. Margaret rotated her linens carefully, keeping some in daily use while others remained protected, extending the life of everything she owned. This meant her family rarely needed to replace major household items, freeing up money for things that mattered far more. This is perhaps the deepest contrast with today's world, where fast fashion and disposable home goods encourage constant replacement. Many families now spend repeatedly on items that wear out quickly, without realizing how much more they're spending over time compared to fewer, higher quality purchases made decades ago. And here is the big reveal, the lesson tying every single rule together. It wasn't the coins, the roast, the swap circle, or the mending kit alone that made 1961 housewives financially resilient. It was the mindset behind all of it, the belief that value came from care, attention, and patience, not from spending more. Every rule we've discussed today was really one philosophy wearing different disguises. Protect what you have, prepare quietly for tomorrow, and never let convenience replace discipline. These women weren't wealthy. They didn't have investment accounts or financial advisors. What they had was awareness, consistency, and a deep sense of responsibility toward their families. That, more than any single trick, is what modern households have quietly lost. So, here's our question for you today. Do you think families today would save more if they returned to using cash, physical routines, and hands-on habits instead of relying entirely on digital convenience? Let us know in the comments below. If this video brought back memories or taught you something your own grandmother might have practiced, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a little of this forgotten wisdom today.